This is Fam Electric Ghost with Aaron Stoner, the founder of PodLoop. So thank you very much for being on the show tonight or this afternoon. I always forget what time zone I'm in because I'm talking to people all over the world.
It's night somewhere. Well, thanks so much for
Yeah,
having
it's
me.
always night somewhere. Yeah, it's great. It's great to be here. Let our listeners and viewers know that we're on the Newsly platform as a featured podcast. Use coupon code GHOST to get 1 month free premium subscription so you can stop scrolling and start listening. We'll be on Newsly later today. So thank you again for being on the show. We are at 8 hour. So we've been on out here for a little bit. So that's always fun to track where we are. And you can maybe talk a little bit about what your service does for people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got PodLoop. It's pod-loop.com, and we do podcast consulting and editing. I started off with editing, but I do have a lot of people that that inquire about it that are just looking to get started with podcasting. So I do help out with uh, consulting that and helping people get started, let them know what equipment to use, what programs to use because it's so easy to launch your own podcast for cheap now. But we also do editing for the more produced type podcast if you want to do any sort of sound design or EQing, mastering, uh, and adding intro, outro music and things like that. So I'm getting more and more into sound design, which is the most fun part of it for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. Being a musician, I actually have music, and I've always thought of taking some of my music and integrating it for like an intro. But it seems like at least on the platform I'm on, it just kind of runs through the whole thing, and I don't want it running through the whole thing because it
Yeah,
interferes with people talking.
it's definitely more complicated when you do stuff live, but there's ways around it. If you set that up, uh, you can do, side chaining where when someone's talking, the music goes down.
Oh yeah, I should probably try that. Like my mixer, I could run it through another channel. I just haven't wanted to like fumble with multiple things at once. So like AI automation would be cool for me for certain things. Like I'm very interested in AI in the distribution side because I'm on
Yeah.
a bunch of platforms and I have to do a lot of manual work, even though I have distributors that automatically cascade. I still have to physically put my information into the different tools. And if I want to make a landing page, I kind of go in and I create it from scratch. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for that type of marketing automation so that you can have your shows and stuff. So I'm wondering, do you do stuff like that to help people with that, or are you more of a
I So I do have a sales background and marketing, so I do help with that in a different sense. But the AI stuff is getting crazy, and I have a good buddy who is deep into AI marketing, so I've been chatting with him on how to. It seems like it's almost there. It's not quite there yet to be like what you're saying to do full distribution automatically, but it's almost.
Yeah, I'm very
Like
interested in that.
there's some companies that claim it can do it, but it's not
Yeah.
quite there yet. But the AI is going crazy, especially for video, audio editing. There's stuff that claims it does it automatically now especially with podcasts, like automatically doing video cuts and audio edits.
Well, that's
You know,
cool.
the normal stuff that takes hours to do in post
What I found
production.
is the transcriptions are still a little off because I had a
Uh huh.
transcriber or something. Then I was like, well, I have to actually go read an hour worth of my podcast to go an hour. So to
Yeah.
me, it wasn't worth it because the amount of like errors it had was like, well, I'm not paying for that because it still had like 30% error
Yeah,
rate.
and
And
it gets real expensive, especially for the long form
yeah,
podcast. But I like to use that for summaries
summary
because
might be good.
you can just get the transcription, plug that into a conversational AI or Chat GPT, and have it summarize it, and that's good uh for doing summaries and show notes and bullet point topics.
Yeah, that might be cool. I have to check and see how good it does because still sometimes what I've seen is it doesn't actually accurately grab that information correctly for my podcast, at least in my experience, at least a couple of tools I use. But it's interesting. How did you get into the idea that you wanted to, create this podcast editing agency? Like, what made you think that that was something that would be needed and you were interested in?
Yeah, great question. So I have a music background as well myself. So I'm a bass player and trumpet player mainly, and I've got a band where we have a studio here in Nashville. We do a full production there too. So um, I've I've been in music production for over a decade, and I love podcasts. Honestly, I was a little hesitant to get started. I've loved podcasts for years, of course, and always thought, in the last few years, thought maybe it was too late to jump into the podcasting game. Because, of course, as you know, the most successful podcasts are the ones that have been around for a decade, forever, for a really long time. Because
Mhm.
a big thing about growing your podcast is the consistency of it. And most podcasts don't make it past like 10 episodes. So
Yeah.
out of the millions of podcasts that are starting now, so consistency is key. So I finally decided, I had some friends from word of mouth just say, like, ask me to edit their podcasts. So I edited a few, um, and so I love audio and audio editing, and especially my wife does voiceover, so I do a lot
Mm.
of dialogue editing as well, and I just like listening. I like just consuming information. So I'm like, I'm listening to podcasts anyway, and so
Mhm.
might as well be editing them while I'm
Yeah,
doing it. So
it's like,
I
like music engineering. Like, if you're into
yeah,
engineering, you wanna be an engineer or you're a producer, like you live and breathe that stuff, and so it's like going into podcasting, it's like, well, it's the same tool set to a certain extent, so there's, like, more video nowadays, so you have to it's not just
yeah,
all audio. So I think audio is still the primary thing for most podcasts, and I do distribute on tons of audio platforms, and the video platforms maybe like 4, and the rest
yeah,
of them are all and there's like maybe 16 platforms I'm on. There's like 4 of them are video, the rest of them are audio.
yeah. So I finally, looking at the stats, it's like podcasts are still exploding and still growing after, even after the pandemic explosions. And so I was like, might as well jump in and get started because I just love audio and creating.
Yeah, I've always been into it because I like the live format. I tried recording ones in the past, and I like the kind of radio nature, like
Yeah,
a radio show. And also, this is the kind of thing the way I do music. I'm kind of a DAW-less guy. I
ah,
like to just go directly to multi-track. I got a lot of analog, a lot of Eurorack type of stuff. And I
yeah,
always like to capture point in time. And what I feel is like, there was a conversation that when John had on Yellow Brick Road, and he said he was kind of lamenting the modern DAW. He said, I was doing Yellow Brick Road in a mansion with the band, and Bernie would write the lyrics, and we put the song down that day. And maybe it's like
yeah,
the third take, and that's it. That's about as far as they would go because they wanted to catch like the honesty of what they were doing. And then if they kept on hitting it, they started getting further away from what their original intent was. And then I
yeah,
kind of felt like I'm podcasting with the live podcast, I kind of get people to tell me really what's in their head rather than, oh, I want to edit that. I want to change that. I want to change that. And I'm like, I'm not into that.
yeah. Like Dolly Parton wrote Jolene and I Will Always Love You in the same day. Like that's the but people don't see the hours of dedication and the years of dedication of trying to do that every day
Yeah.
that went in before that. But when you're in there and the magic hits, the live creation in the moment is the best in my opinion as well. But
Yeah.
and
You know
also
what?
I use Ableton Live for all my editing stuff too. So are you familiar with?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
familiar with DAWs, but I live in like live tracks and now 20s and Tascam 20s. And I like the feel because I started with Fostex and
Full
Tascam drills.
analog stuff, yeah.
I like the feel of just learning my song, going
And that's
in
what it
and
is.
playing. Yeah,
It's the feel of it. the feel
Yeah.
of it. And there's stuff like that that people don't hear. It's just like you just feel it. And I've like, and that's something with podcasts too, especially with people getting started. Sometimes they don't realize how the audio um, can affect the listener even subliminally, because there's
Mm,
like ear fatigue and things that are happening subliminally when you're listening to music and when you're listening to audio that you don't necessarily know. But the feel of the analog is the thing that like hits you,
yeah. It's like my
that's what you
Moog.
feel,
You
and
know,
it hits you
why,
deep.
why,
Yeah, the
why,
Moog stuff,
yeah.
dude.
It
Oh
was like
man.
why I use a Moog bass rather than a digital Moog is because the analog Moog, when I run it through like, Neve processors and stuff, it
Mhm.
just, if I run that totally into a DAW, like I find I lose some of it.
Uh-huh.
And what I like, and I know like the world was like, there's this whole thing that happened with the DX7. I don't know if I'm going to kind of diverge into things,
No, do
but
it.
being a synth head, when the FM digital synth came and the Roland D50 came, the recording engineers loved it because the analog was taking up a lot of the headroom. And so when you had the digital synths, they didn't take up as much headroom and you could layer stuff. But what they lost was the sounds that you used to get from like Emerson, Lake and Palmer and the Stevie Wonders of the world and Yes and Genesis is that those analog synths, they do take up a lot of bandwidth. They do take up a lot of headroom, but there's something about them that's actually, he's like an EMS VC3 from like Pink Floyd. There's something about that analog signal that digital doesn't recreate. You can
Mhm.
try to get close, but it never really matches it. And there's something about that. I just like that untamed sound, and I like the feel of it. It's almost organic, even though it's a machine. And when you deal with the analog synths, they have a lot of expression, kind of like a Hammond organ. Like if you've got the drawbars, when you've got your Moog, you have so many controls you can actually make them part of the performance. So if you're a keyboardist and you're on a mini Moog, you're on a Voyager, you're on like a Prophet 5, all those controls are part of the performance. And if you ever watched a Bernie Worrell or a Rick Wakeman, you can see them actually touching their modes and touching their
Mhm.
profits because it's actually like the drawbars on a B3. It's the same thing. And that's the kind of thing I think people lose with the mouse. Yeah, you could technically get to it, but it's not the same as actually doing it real time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I did a session with a pump organ session the other day where we set up mics all over this big church and just slammed this pump organ as loud
Captured
as it
it.
could go, and it's just like that's just we had to have like 8 mics on it
Catch
to
it.
try
Yeah.
to capture it, but it's just
Yeah.
so much information and so beefy is wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I love about that is just kind of like the feel. I'm kind of into the punk aesthetic. I love listening to the Clash and bands like Husker Du. And I love this album like Zen Arcade. They did it like within 48 hours. They went into a
Mhm,
warehouse and they just cut it. And I'm like, I kind of like that idea. And I like the idea, like what Frank Zappa, he used to go and like record his live shows and then go
mhm.
back to his living room and listen to the tapes and then
Yeah,
kind of say, okay, this goes with this goes with that. And just have this kind of freeform kind of fusion feel to how you record. And like, not that you're going to take everything that you laid down, but you use that kind of performance to kind of figure out what you're going to do to the
that's
point. Yeah.
the Wolfpack. Are you familiar with Wolfpack?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's their mindset too. Because after, they stole the Beatles idea, but they're just say, like, "Just put 1 mic on every instrument." Like, you don't need to get too complicated, just do the Beatles thing, do the Abbey Road thing, and just put 1 mic on everything and get in a room and play it all together. Because there's nothing better than that. If you look at, Wolfpack, Beatles stuff, the any Funk Brothers stuff,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
all
It's
that,
kind of what
it's like
it is.
it's live and simple.
That's why I like some of my live track stuff that I got where every input to my mixer actually gets its own stem, right? So if I got all my modes going into their own channel, they all get recorded. And then
Yep.
later I can kind of play with them. And then, my R20, I can move them around like a DAW. It actually has a
Uh-huh.
touch screen and I can move tracks around. And
Yeah.
so I can lay it down and I can like reprocess it after, or I could let it go. and just kind of like, I don't know, it's just the feel of that kind of like, I call it like stream of consciousness recording. You
Yeah,
know, it's just, it's
exactly.
kind of
And
like a poet doing just a, like going on the mic and just free forming it,
yeah,
like old
freestyle
school,
and improv.
hip hop guys, you know, back in the
Mhm.
day, like the old OGs.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, there's something about when you can do that, like the Grandmaster Flashes of the world is like, you know, KRS-One, like, yeah, there's something about when you can do that and they actually are on vinyl and the DJ's on a vinyl, not a CDJ, and like there's a certain talent to be able to do that,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, that it's like equal to playing on the Moog.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, what other services you were talking about, like your cutting edge audio editing, and you know, being able to increase the listening experience of a podcast. So, maybe talk about that whole process and what you do with a client. Like when somebody engages you, what can they expect?
So I've got this. I'm trying out this quick start edit right now, where if once you inquire, I'll shoot you a text and Dropbox immediately send you a Dropbox folder, and you just upload your audio, and I'll put that together in an episode within 48 hours and send it back to you. I do one thing that I've been doing that I like to do with a lot of the new podcasts, like, is take bits of the podcast uh, to create some sort of, intro, outro, or, like, for example,
Reel,
there's
a
I
clip or reel or something.
yeah, and use that throughout, create themes, create drops and segments. So, if you say something catchy, save that for future episodes as a familiar
Oh,
thing that triggers something in the listeners that is like, oh yeah, I know that that's familiar to me, and engages people more. Like for example, there's this one podcast on their first episode. These guys just had a buddy with a guitar that was there who just played a little guitar lick, and I ended up taking that, and it wasn't supposed to be, but that's the intro. And then
right
I
there.
chopped it up and have little pieces for transitions throughout. So it's like that's the organic, like improv stuff, the things that
Yeah,
are actually happening that's unique to that podcast that can loops back and is familiar. Also, so the podcast is called Beers and Sunshine. So they on the podcast they'll open beers on the podcast. So I'll take those clips of like a
yeah,
and
yeah.
actually
Use it.
I'll use that sound to censor, curse words later in the episode if
Oh, if
no
they
one's
have it.
listening.
Oh, that's cool. So you're free
You know,
forming. That's the add on. That's the additional benefit of like if you're when you're recording an album and you go and get a recording engineer and a producer, and then they start to say, hey, you know, maybe we should have shadow vocals, or maybe you should do this layer, maybe you should do this, change the transition, or make the intro like part of a fill, or make that, you know, change it. So that's the added benefit of having the years of experience with, like, when you somewhat, you know, because like if you're a musician, you know, we get tunnel vision. We write the demo and it's like, this is what I think it should be, right? And then sometimes it's like you should open it up to have other people interpret your stuff, and then you can get like better acceptance, which it seems like that's what you're doing. You're kind of finishing it off.
definitely, and that's been my role in music too, is much more on the production and post production than the creation. As a bass player, I'm not writing the songs. I'm
Mhm.
often adding to the songs and arranging and doing the production you're talking about. So I love doing that with podcasts too. And the next level of that is the full sound design. And
Mhm.
there's a few like um, there's a few podcasts that are improv comedy podcasts that I listen to that do amazing sound design. Where instead of having like a room tone or something, they actually create full background noises where it sounds like they're in like a it sounds like
Oh,
they're in a public place, or
mhm.
depending on where they are in the story, there's a different background bass noise, and then full sound effects and creating
That's
sound effects
interesting
like that is fun
because
too.
because I had the story about George Martin. George Martin and the Beatles, like people don't realize that George Martin was the production engineer, producer for Peter Sellers. And
Hmm.
Peter Sellers used to do these comedy records. And the comedy records had all kinds of tape loops and effects and all kinds of special aspects. And actually, the four lads, like the Beatles, they had actually liked what was going on those Peter Sellers records. And when they found out George Martin had actually produced them, then they said, "Well, what if we did that with a rock band?" And that
Yep.
kind of in the genesis of like when you get to Rubber Soul and you get to like Sergeant Pepper's, is they started taking that full effect of what he had done on the Peter Sellers records and apply it to a rock band
Yep.
and make it like, and he's like, I could record them like they're in Hamburg, but if I use the studio like Monet uses the painting, right? You can do expressionist stuff that you can't do necessarily live, or maybe you can now. But there's stuff in the studio you could do that you can't do live, right?
Exactly, and that's the same thing that, that happened with when Pro Tools came out and the analog people saying like, "Oh, that's cheating," or "That's gonna take over the jobs." And same thing that's happening with AI now, where the people are like, "It's gonna take over creative jobs," where it's not like it's just a new tool, and you can choose to stick with what you got or choose to move forward with stuff, and you can do some crazy stuff with the the new technology using it as a tool. If you think of it as, you know, as a tool to use for creating rather than replacing the creative.
Yeah, I think the problem is when people think of like, I'm gonna make a AI podcast to replace the human host,
Right.
right? And I'm
Right.
like, or if you say I'm gonna replace all the members of the band
Yeah.
and just have AI music, I look at it like, I use Roland's, and Roland's got this thing called like an intelligent arpeggiator. And it's not exactly AI, but it knows like when you're playing keys to actually put in bass lines, and bass lines follow what you do. And it's
Yeah,
kind of
but it's
like the future of AI is that, if you're a solo musician and like, hey, I would love to have a string section, I can't afford it. So maybe you
yeah.
can, maybe I go and have a little Tchaikovsky here, or like go Beethoven or something, or I want to feel like this, and you can mention it, and it was like, oh yeah, it'll bring it in, and then
Yep.
you're still writing the song, but you're getting some enhancement. I don't see that the problem with that is probably when you try to replace 99% of what you're doing, then I kind of like, I don't know if that's the best idea.
Well, it's the combination of ideas, which is the same thing our brains do is for in like an improv jazz musician is like isn't playing anything they've never played before. They aren't
Yeah,
playing
it's
notes they
ridiculous.
haven't played before. They've just played
Yeah,
all the notes so many times and all the combinations of notes so many times that you can feel it. They don't have to think about it and
merging
they can just go with it. So they may be pulling from, Louis Armstrong or Dizzy Gillespie, uh,
or a
like
show tune. Like I've heard
or
jazz
show tune. Yeah,
musicians pull a show tune into a
they
thing,
memorize so
and
much stuff, so they can pull that stuff all the time.
yeah,
So, the what AI allows you to do is create the combinations that that your brain does, the combinations of stuff that so you could, essentially, maybe at some point say, like, "I want, uh, a Questlove style playing Ringo sounding drums with, George Martin style production and,
yeah,
like,
it
take
becomes yeah, it becomes a
input
hybrid.
all this information into the AI and then make your own combination of what you want production to sound like
Yeah, I think I think it would really be cool is if you could get it to do the engineering things,
yeah.
like it's actually replicating like the Neve board, right?
Yes.
Where it's replicating what George Martin did on this,
Right, right, right,
what
right.
Todd Rundgren did on this, and
Yep.
say, I want that production treatment to be done on my song, right? And if it could do that, I think that's really cool. I mean, I
Yep.
mean, recording engineers probably like, oh, don't do that.
Yeah,
But
but they can I mean, you can use that as a tool. Did you see was it today? I think, Grimes
mhm. Yeah, no
came
Grimes.
out with the thing saying, like, if you use AI and my voice with AI, I'll give you 50% of the royalties. Because all these people are making like uh,
Yeah.
Drake AI
Well,
copies that are being
yeah. Well, I
deleted
think
from
the
the
only
internet.
issue is the digital rights management has to get on top. Like if you start
Yeah,
pulling and you don't get authority, it's it's still somebody's work. Like if somebody pulls something that's distinctively Drake or is distinctively, a Polish artist and you didn't give it credit, that's where I think it's the kind of like the
yeah,
footnotes in the credit. Like as long as people get credit, then most people will say, okay. But some musicians are like, you got to get clearance because they don't want you doing it.
right.
But
But there's no roadmap for how that works or
I think that's the
what the
problem in the
royalties would
future.
be. So Grimes has started that by saying like, and I think
See,
that's a great move because how many Grimes songs may come out of that. That's free press and free money for her without doing any work.
yeah,
And
well, she took the tiger by the tail
yeah,
and decided to deal with it rather than letting the industry deal with it. Now I think the recording industry is trying to create some kind of structure like digital rights management, like the copyright kind
mm,
of violations we get today. And it's gonna have to be something that gets with the business people and the lawyers and the artists. You got some
yeah,
artists that probably be like, I'm not like Neil Young. I love Neil Young, but he's probably gonna be like, no. It's like because
yeah,
like that's his opinion.
yeah.
Maybe I'm
But he
speaking
doesn't
for him, but
doesn't
like
need to.
that's his point of view. But
Yeah, yeah,
But I think if
and
people take it where you want to take it. Like I think as long as my whole thing is like if an artist should get credit, like I always was a little ticked off when like Zeppelin didn't credit Led Belly or Robert Johnson, and
right.
then the Stones and Keith Richards they did. And when
Mhm.
they did it, to me is that just have the respect as an artist if you're gonna take something that's Led Belly or Robert Johnson, don't act like you wrote the whole thing when you
Yeah,
know that you didn't. Like
yeah. And now there's that other what's that other band that sounds like Led Zeppelin?
oh yeah, there's a new band that's out there that kind of channeling that. Yeah, I've heard
Yeah,
'em. I know who you're talking about. So yeah, man, they're
right.
channeling Johnson and all those other guys too. I mean, the blues is the blues, but
Yeah.
there's some things that you can say, well, that's kind of verbatim Robert Johnson. That's really taking it.
And that's
So
what's
that
interesting. It's like you can like, are you straight up copying it on purpose, or is that just such an influence on your style that you don't even realize you sound exactly like uh
yeah, I think a lot of
is
people kind of know Jimmy Page is
Greta
such a
Van
good
Fleet. It's like
yeah,
Greta
Greta
Van
Van
Fleet.
Fleet, yeah, yeah,
Why aren't they just a Zeppelin cover band? Like, would they have more success
yeah,
just
maybe.
as a cover band? I don't know.
Well, it's kind of where your feel is, because their feel is so like really in the zone, and
Yeah,
they're kind of really mimicking it. And some critics have really been heavy on them,
yeah,
saying like you guys need to be a little bit like Aerosmith. They're not exactly Zeppelin. They're like their own thing.
right.
And so it's like there's a whole thing of like, well, you could be in the zone, but you still can go off. It's like when Stevie Ray Vaughan plays Voodoo Child, it's the Texas blues version of Voodoo Child.
Right.
It stands on its own against what the cosmic version of Hendrix's cosmic version is like. That's it. That's his.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
Stevie is coming from a different perspective, and it's still good.
Yeah.
But it's like both of them stand because they're not exactly the same. It's like
Y-
there's a lot of differences in terms of how it is. If you really listen, it's not the same.
And you don't do covers. People don't do covers like that anymore. Or like, back then everyone passes around a song because it's a great song. So you write an amazing song and then all the everybody plays their own and puts their own spin, their own version on it, their own style on it.
Mhm.
And I feel like people aren't writing songs good enough to do that anymore. So you have to do a remix. So you
Yeah,
have to you have to
remix.
do your own version of the production of it to actually make it sound good, but it's what's the deal? Are all the good songs written?
No, I don't
And
think so. I think it's the problem is I think you got some producers that like to clone too much. In my opinion, I see people using the same drops and the same plugins and the same stuff. Is like really, and I have a feeling some of them are doing it because they just want to keep on getting the royalties from the
because it
reusers.
works, yeah, if
Same thing.
you do what works.
Yeah, we're doing work, so you keep on getting paid
Yeah, why
because
not?
it's the same thing. over and over. But yeah, it's like where are you going to get the courage of a guy like a Dylan to go and
Right.
do what he did, which was like totally against the grain, to
Mhm.
do what he did with his voice. People say, well, that's not what a singer does. But then he
Mhm.
made it what a singer can do. And then he inspired a whole generation of people that don't have to be like Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole. They don't have to have perfect pitch.
Yeah.
And so the idea of the singer songwriter that you could come in there, you didn't have to have somebody in Tin Pan Alley, that you could actually write it, and you
Mhm.
could sing it, and it could be you. And it seems like some of that is kind of going away, where people want to be Beyonce, or they want to be Taylor Swift. They want to be exactly the standard bearer, and they're not willing to kind of take the risk that the singer songwriters did of being uniquely, themselves.
Yep.
You know, and so I still live in the underground, of trying to find the next Joy Division, the next Husker Du, the next replacements. I'm always looking, and that's who I interview a lot. I interview a lot of bands from the underground that people don't
Oh,
know,
cool.
because that's what I don't do as much as I used to, maybe one or two interviews a month. But that is kind of my love when I started as a podcaster, is because that's as like kind of like a college radio guy, because I
Mhm.
was one of those kids that heard REM on IRS,
Yeah.
heard Joy Division, that saw Duran Duran before they broke, and then you like saw Echo and a Bunnyman and say, yeah, that's kicking. That's something that's cool, and that I've always been interested in the bands that people don't listen to, and then
Mhm.
become, they end up getting signed. The
Mhm.
replacements got signed. Who Skidoo got signed. That stuff happens. Nirvana, they were on Sub Pop, and then suddenly they broke because they were pushing it, and that's where I would like to see more people pushing it, and there are people pushing it. It's just the A&R people aren't pushing it.
Yeah. And just like, for the music stuff, or just like anything, any freelance job, or any passion you wanna pursue on your own, like, you can't get fired
Yeah, but when you love it.
from creating. You can only quit, so you're only a failure if you give up. And just like any creator, or music, there's so many stories of bands that you hear about. They just like, oh, they blew up overnight. It's like, no,
Yeah, they've been
they've
around a
been
while.
grinding for a decade, and then this is just the first time you've heard of them, so it looks to you like they
Well,
blew
like the
up.
Velvets, I mean, nobody knew the Velvet Underground at all
Yeah.
until finally he broke with Transformer, because Bowie loved what the Velvets were, and then he helped them, give them like super powered, you know, assistance, and then
Yeah, but it
just
wasn't
walk
just
on
that one thing, it was everything before that,
well,
leading up to that
everything from
one
like
thing.
'66 to the mid '70s.
Uh-huh.
The Velvet stuff had been out there from 1966, and
Mhm.
then he basically took the same ideas that a lot of musicians that heard it said, "Well, that stuff's fantastic." Like Bowie,
Yeah.
there's all these people heard it and like, yeah, that's great. He triggered so many bands. And he's like, well, I wish I got the money. Yeah, like Lou Reed one time said, I wish I got the money from all the people who said they were inspired by me. But yeah, he finally
Yeah.
kind of broke through. But it was like, he found a way to get that voice out there. And it wasn't the same as the Velvets, but the content was the lyrics were still in the same vein of what he had been doing. In
Mhm.
in the mid Walk on the Wild Side is not that different from stuff that's on like on a Velvet Underground and Nico. It's the same content, it's the same type of lyrics. It's just it
Mhm.
broke through because it had better production. Um, and it's just that's the kind of thing that can happen where a band, because like my big band that a lot of people don't really know about is a Big Star, Alex Chilton and Big Star. And I don't know if you're ever into them, but they were like this power pop band from the '70s that was unknown, and they influenced a lot of alternative bands, from the Pumpkins to like Pearl Jam. A lot of people will name check
Mhm.
replacements. Paul Westerberg name checked Alex Chilton like all the time, um, because it was just something about the way they put together things in their first three records, like number one record, Radio City, third. I still listen to that stuff. And people was like, well, that's not what's happening, but it's like, it's what's happening for me.
Yeah, yeah. It's still good. Yeah.
But yeah, it's just interesting how you can take your passion and apply it. And in the whole thing about podcast, what I love about it is like we're living in this world where we have these free form discussions and they go longer than 5 minutes.
Hmm.
And that's kind of like we're in a 5 minute, 30-second, 90-second culture. And the podcast is able to kind of, slow it down and get people to listen to something a little bit longer. And, and that to me has been something I really enjoy about it.
And it's really interesting over some like lockdown pandemic situations where it seems like there were podcasts that were in a way, I I don't want to say, but maybe fully replacing like community. So the like people attach to personalities in their favorite podcasts as if, I there are certain people that I can think of that I'm like, I wish I was friends with them, or even
Mhm,
like I feel like I am friends with them because of
mhm,
all
'cause
the
of the
time that we've spent together, So it's like there's and you can do it anytime. So people are just like, especially working from home, plugging into the podcast all day.
Yeah, it was
It's
kinda like
it's
that
really
YouTuber thing. Like,
fascinating.
I was always I'm still into Dashi, like and when I watch him, I just like, "Wow." I just, like,
Yeah,
hit the entertainment value, and he's not even playing the games, like, at the high level of a ultimate gamer. He's funny. He's like watching
yeah,
Saturday Night Live, and it's like that, you feel like, wow, it's like that personality,
yeah.
and I think that's what comes through is, like, they have people that actually have, like, entertainment level personality,
Yeah,
and
I
you're
think
like,
of
"Wow."
John Mayer too. I think the other day I watched him for like an hour, like not playing music, but putting together like a some carrying case. I don't know what it was, but it's just like I was just, how did I do this? Like, what happened? Like, why did I get sucked into this?
You wanna get sucked into that, yeah. But, yeah, it's interesting because it's just I think people just like to have that connection where, like,
Yeah,
people are authentic and they kinda show themselves. You feel like you get to know them, and that makes people the comfortable, and, the podcast world is just able to get you get exposed to a lot of different people. You get to see, who they are, and they make you feel like you want to come back. I think that's just something we've been able to, be out here. We're not the biggest person out here, but what we've been able to do is be consistent. Because people
yeah,
told us, oh, they fail after 12 episodes, and we've been out here like 894.
yeah. You're
And I
not
think
failing. You're just stopping.
yeah,
Like,
we just keep on going. And like the way we just kept on going and we're getting, benefits. We're getting numbers now. We're starting to get some numbers. And it wasn't about the numbers. It was about like we just like to do it.
yeah,
And it's
and
and it's just started coming into our brand. It's helped our music. It's helped us have connections. We've been able to work with other producers, be able to work with other bands. Just because people have seen us and found something interesting and say, "Hey, we want to talk to that fandom." I want to talk to Keith. And people come to me, and then they're like, "Hey, I'm working with different people on different things. Some of the life coaches I get into, they're interested in music therapy, and they want me to put some ambient music together. Get people want me to write theme songs for their nonprofits. You get all kinds of work that you would have never thought
oh yeah, that too.
that this comes in, just
Mhm.
because you're out there and because you're out there consistently. And I just try to link music to other things. And so people say, how can a music guy talk to a CEO? Well, everybody loves the Beatles. And they were like,
Music guys can talk to anyone, man.
yeah, it's like well, like an influencer like the Beatles, how many people did they influence? Right?
Yeah,
Like so the idea that you can't talk to influencers or you can't talk to people like music is a communication language. People hear something and they see a sound painting, they get brought into a film, they get brought into an emotion. It can help you like straighten your mind out if you've been like freaking out and you're all you go and you listen to Enya, to
yeah.
calm
Oh
down.
yeah.
You gotta
It's
calm down.
it's magic, man.
Yeah, it's like you want to get hyped, you get some funk, you listen some James Brown, and then you
Yeah.
get happy, you know, and
Yeah.
you can get involved in like whatever Dylan was writing. He's like, wow, That's amazing. That's like Pulitzer Prize winning poetry. And
Hmm.
you're like, yeah, this is just a form that can really help you. And that's the way I decided, like, I'm gonna weave how music is connected to like everything. And that's
Yeah.
been my whole thing. And it's interesting that you're coming from like a sound production and music point of view to increase the capabilities or an enhanced podcast.
And that's the thing, talking about personalities, because I've done a lot of vocal production in coaching, like a singer in a microphone. A lot of times people just have sing live a lot, but don't have a lot of time in the studio, and then they come in the studio, and
Different technique. Yeah.
you have to create an atmosphere where they're comfortable doing that, where and just singers can be uh
Temperamental.
yeah. Oh, well, on the emotional side of process of like emotional processors. So there's a lot of in this. I think Rick Rubin talks about this a lot too. It's all about creating a comfortable, safe atmosphere, and then sneaking in the actual suggestions of what you think they should do. And it's very similar with podcasts too, especially people getting started with new podcasts. People think they have this character or persona of themselves that they want to be perceived as. So when they first start a podcast, there's something there, and sometimes it can be perceived as inauthentic
Mhm.
to to uh to the listener, and you gotta like I have to constantly encourage people to like be yourself. Like, no, we don't need to cut that thing out. That like
That
people
makes you
say,
you.
I want to cut this out. And it's like, no, that's a vulnerable moment of you being vulnerable. And it's yeah, maybe hard for you to listen back to or like embarrassing, but that's
Mhm.
the thing that is your personality, that is the uniquely you thing that people will attach to in a podcast, and why uh you don't need to be someone else. The Your
Yeah.
podcast is going to be better, and people are going to perceive your vulnerability when you're more yourself.
It's like the happy accident. Like if you go
Yeah.
into the studio, right, and somebody is
Oh
like
yeah.
not they're not on the mic they want to be on, but they end up doing like a
Yeah.
unbelievably heartfelt performance. And then they say, "Well, I want to go do this on the better mic," and then they don't capture the same
Yeah.
performance.
Yeah.
Then you're
That's the
like,
Ryan Adams thing too. He says like, "Oh, I need to redo that part." And he's like, "No, you can't pay for mistakes like that. Like
"Yeah,
leave that makes
leave
it
it."
real. Even like the tiniest mistake, like that's human and that's authentic and that's real. We don't need to redo that."
Yeah, and even on Todd Rundgren's Something Anything, he actually has like a little bit of clip of him doing production work in the studio, and he said, "Yeah, this is bad editing. This is like a happy accident. This is like me cutting the tape and not putting it back
Yeah.
right." And it's like, and if you listen to "Hello, It's Me" and you actually listen to it, it's got like miscues on the mic. It's got like some drum, parts that are a little off. It's got stuff going on, and if you listen to it, and it was left in there. And it's
Yeah.
like there's something about that in the '70s where people had some of these micro errors or happy accidents. And it's the Stones, like Keith Richards, like the way he plays on Exile on Main Street. You don't want to fix that.
Oh,
You
yeah,
like
there's the with
you
Steven
leave it in
Tyler
there.
talks about dropping or, like, breaking a thing, and you can still hear it in the recording, like,
Yeah,
he
yeah, you can hear it, and it's like
vibra
some of that.
slap, he breaks the vibra slap, and it left it in the recording.
Yeah, there's a lot that's interesting about leaving that stuff in, and then you get people. And I loved, I mean, the dog made people have access to a lot, but one of the things people make the mistake of trying to make things perfect. And I
Yep,
think like music has never been perfect.
yep,
You know, you listen to the stuff from the '20s and the '30s, and there's something
and
about, that, the really old music. And I was listening to a lot of stuff on vinyl that my father had. And I was like, wow, this stuff is just fantastic. But I don't think people would let it out of the studio now, you
yeah,
know? And it's like, that's a problem.
yeah, and, I mean, hopefully, in kind of integrating the previous conversation about AI into it too, like, hopefully I think we will still value that humanness in the human creation. So like we can use AI as a tool in music or in whatever creative thing, but you still have to have the human driving it and have the, I guess, infallibility and like you still got to have mistakes.
Yeah, that's kind of like when people were. I think there was this conversation that Miles Davis was having with this interview person. The person was interviewing him. He said, "Well, how much do you practice? You must practice." Like, say, it's not about the practice. How are you going to practice for improvisation? It's like you don't. How are you going to know what you the unknown? And I was watching a lot of jazz musicians were pointing out that like practicing over and over doesn't actually let you get like bebop or fusion or any of the forms. Is like it's actually the communication that you have with your bandmates is living in the present and knowing what to do when somebody hits that bad note and hits the bad key, how you recover from it or how you turn it into an opportunity.
And that's the Einstein quote, is the insanity is doing the same thing over and over. And I
Yeah,
feel like people mistake that quote and they use that and say, don't do the same thing over and over. But doing the same thing over and over is practice. Like practice is attempting to do the same thing over and over and getting a different result.
yeah, yeah,
So it like there is a little bit of insanity that goes into being such a specialist on an instrument. And like the hours and hours doing whatever you want to call it, whether it's practice or actually doing,
yeah.
like
Exercises.
performing,
Yeah,
exercise. Yeah,
yeah,
exercising.
yeah.
The
Exercise is
same thing
kind
in the
of better.
gym, like
Yeah,
lifting in the gym is insanity. You're doing the same thing over and over and get different results.
yeah. It's the whole point is like when you're practicing and you're doing those exercises, it's like Zappa. People asked him like he could read and he could write,
Yeah,
but he used to say like I don't want to play my guitar solos the same.
yeah,
There's a quote about it, like I'm not going to play them the same way, and some people make in a lot of heavy metal music like it's actually part of the song to play that solo exactly the same. From like the
yeah.
Iron Maidens of the world and stuff like that, they're into like playing that solo exactly the same, and I understand
Yeah.
that's part of the form. But when you look
That's
at
not Frank Zappa.
Zappa was like, "No, that's not what I do."
Yeah.
But that
Th
each to their own. But I mean, that was his thing. To him, it wasn't fun, and I
'Cause
kind of
he's
yeah,
not a guitarist. He's not
he's more of a
he's a
composer.
performer. He's a
Yeah,
personality and a performer. Like Iron Maiden's
he's a
uh,
yeah group. Yeah, it's
a
like
I don't know. Yeah, there's different things, different ways
yeah.
to
Well,
do it.
their audience kind of expects it because the kind of way they wrote it.
Yeah,
They
that's
like the
their
Judas Priest.
personality. That's
Yeah, the
their
Judas Priests of the world and Iron
yeah,
Maidens. They kind of get themselves into that. That's part of the performance, and their fans expect them to. It's an integral part. That solo is exact. It's like somebody singing the lyrics. It's like
yeah,
it's tied to the song. It is
yeah,
part of the structure. It's kind of like classical music. It seems like it's got some classical music aspects where there some heavy metal types starts to get into the foundational stuff that's like it's on the bars, it's written down, that's what it is.
yeah. I'm a big Coheed and Cambria fan. They're a big Iron Maiden influence.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
They do
interesting.
the same thing.
I like everything. I listen to like anything that's out there. Like people like, oh, wow, he's like from Johnny Cash to Black Sabbath.
Yeah,
I'm all over the place. I'm like into like I've been listening to a lot of Sun Ra. There's a jazz band, and people might not know they went and did bebop, and then they did fusion, kind of ahead of
yeah, yeah,
Miles Davis, and um, and they dressed up kind of like Funkadelic before Funkadelic.
yeah.
Which I think Funkadelic maybe copied them because they used to dress in space costumes in like '56,
See, did
and
they copy him? That's what's interesting. They just you can't know if they copied him
I think
or were
well, I think George Clinton knew about it, and they said, well, maybe the '70s is the right time for this, and it was.
Yep. Yeah, yeah,
Like in '56 and '57, it's like people were like looking at this bebop band that dressed like space aliens, and they're like, "What's that?" And
yeah.
it didn't really go over that well. But like by the time you get to the mothership, it's like, oh yeah, that does make sense.
Mhm.
It's like
Yeah.
sometimes you do something a little ahead of the curve. But
Yep.
so yeah, so for pod-loop.com, if people go there, what would they find? Is there a way to book like your work, they can engage you right there.
Yeah, they can just put their contact information there. There's just a little form to fill out and contact. There's a list of all the services there. So um, if you put your contact in, I'll send you text within a day and see where you're at and how we can get started and how I can help out with getting started with a
And I
new
think
podcast or reworking an old podcast or continuing with podcasts you got going if you want to improve your audio quality.
what do you think about like the reels and the clips and the shorts of the world? Is like, is there? I've been actually experimenting with taking clips from my podcast and putting them into reels and putting them in the shorts, putting them on those type of formats. Is that something that you think is a good way to engage?
Oh yeah, definitely. And that's something I provide too when I edit a podcast. I'll cut out the highlights and the those real type uh,
Type
clips. And
clips?
I think that's really important, especially with however, they keep changing algorithms and how they work. And I heard
Yeah,
something the other day, especially for marketing, and this was in the context of music, like if you're an artist and if you're a podcaster, like especially on social media, you need to act like no one's ever heard of you. So having like people record a podcast and then put up one clip or one social media announcement saying this episode is out, and that doesn't go to even all of your followers unless
yeah,
they
yeah,
so like the people that are blowing up on social media and in the podcast world are posting at every day or consistently. So the
yeah, yeah,
algorithms like consistency. So whatever your schedule is, the same time every week, same time every day, like you benefit from just posting something at the same time, uh, and getting a schedule going. And it's interesting because I've noticed, getting older, that's the same in life stuff, in improving in just in real life and growing as a person. The habits are the important thing in doing routine habitual things. So
yeah. It's like showing up. It's like our podcast is
yeah,
always showing up, and we've been
yeah,
using tools like Facebook events and YouTube events to push it out, so that like a week or two, like we've got stuff posted going out to like July
yeah,
as Facebook events and YouTube events, and then we run clips and then we run reels, and and we've been getting bigger engagement. It's starting to it's an effort because the
yeah.
algorithms shift. We'll do something and the algorithm is suddenly doing good, and then suddenly it drops because then they're like,
And,
oh, we don't want to support that way of doing anymore, and so we got to try a different way.
and you got to
So,
have the consistency to hit it when it's right, because people don't you can't predict virality.
yeah, yeah, it's hard to predict that. You just got to keep on pushing. But it's
But
great.
with especially with AI creation, and we're gonna hit so much of a huge, like, quantity of content
They're
that at some
swarming
point
out.
I have to believe that it's gonna focus back down to quality. Like, you have to have quality. Like, humans adjust very quickly, and then we're gonna learn, I think, how
Get
to
through the
scope out
noise.
the fake things and
Yeah, the noise.
really
Like you
focus
get
in on yeah.
with the Max Headroom artificial AI podcast host
Yeah.
might engage people initially, but then when there becomes 1,000 copies of that, and
Yeah,
then
that's
people
not
are gonna get like, "I don't like that." The people are just gonna get bored of it.
you're not
If
gonna listen to hundreds of episodes of that.
no, eventually you're gonna like, "Well, that looks like that's like, it's like yesterday."
Yeah, yeah,
So it's like, I think the variability of a human being, you just don't know what they're gonna do, and the
yep,
predictability is like, yeah, it's fine, but they also people want to be challenged and they like the authentic human factor. And I
yep,
think that's always going to be so. It's never going to get hand built cars. People are still going to want hand built cars.
yeah,
They're going to want the Ferraris and the Lamborghinis, even if something's mass built. There's always
and
somebody
yeah,
who wants the
and
custom.
analog synths
Yeah, yeah, the custom
and
motorcycle, custom
and
mountain bike.
'70s
Yeah,
vintage basses.
yeah, people go looking for it. They go looking for that hand built stuff, and there's still going to be a niche for people who do that. And
Yep,
I think it's not going to knock everybody out, but you do have to be forward thinking. You have to you figure out what could you do that is uniquely human that's going to kick. Because some things like, yeah, the McDonald's might be fully automated and you can't probably work there anymore.
Yep.
That's probably going to be gone. So it's like if that's what you were aspiring to, like you maybe you have to aspire a little more because that's probably not going to be around. Um, but that I think human beings are made to do more than like flip burgers and do stuff. So maybe that'll get people more into their authentic self anyway.
Yes. Yes. That's the
So
key.
thank you again.
Authenticity.
Thank you again for being on the show. We sorry to kick off, but we have another one
Oh
coming
no.
up. But yeah, we'll get you the landing page for your audience, and so they can watch or listen to this however they want to. That will be later today, and you'll be able to put that out there. And if you do want an MP4, we can actually send that to the email. I think you have an email on the calendar. So if you want
Yep.
that, you can use that however you want, cut it up. So we'll give you the MP4 so you can do that. And we can also send the MP3, but I don't know if the MP4 is good enough. You let me know.
That'll be great. Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, thank you. Have a good day.
You too.